Good evening. Welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's program with Camille Owens on her book, Like Children, Black Prodigy and the Measure of the Human in America. We are coming to you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. My name is Nan Wolverton, Vice President for Academic and Public Programs. As a National Research Library, our mission is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in the primary sources in our vast pre-1900 collections that we've been collecting here since 1812. These collections include newspapers, books, engravings, maps, scrapbooks, political cartoons, letters, diaries, account books, and materials written by and for children. And you'll see some of these materials in tonight's program. We foster a broad community of inquiry through inclusive programs and generous support of scholarship. We welcome researchers from around the world to use our collections, both physical and digital, and we host programs like this one that provide insights into the past and its resonance for today. Many of our programs feature former fellows, scholars who have conducted research in our collections, and that is the case this evening. I'll say more about that when I introduce our speaker. This program is being recorded, and you can watch recordings of all of our programs on our YouTube channel. And the easiest way to do that is just to go to our website, americanantiquarian.org. You'll find a link for that in the chat, and just locate the Programs and Events tab to find all of the recordings of our former programs. We will have time for your questions later on in the program, and you can post them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. My colleague, Lauren Haviles, Programs Coordinator, will be putting relevant information into the chat throughout the program. And please know that as a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support that you can provide to help keep our work going, and we thank you for that. And it is now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker. Camille Owens is an assistant professor of English at McGill University. She works at the intersection of Black studies, disability studies, and the history of American childhood. Dr. Owens received her PhD in American Studies and African American Studies from Yale University in 2020, and she held a junior fellowship at the Harvard Society of Fellows from 2020 to 2023. In 2018, she held a Justin Schiller Fellowship for the study of children's books here at the American Antiquarian Society. Owens has published essays in American Quarterly, in Early American Literature, and in Disability Studies Quarterly. Tonight, she will be presenting on her new book, Like Children, Black Prodigy and the Measure of the Human in America, published by New York University Press in 2024. We are delighted to welcome Camille back virtually to AAS. Camille, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Nan, for that introduction. And thank you to the American Antiquarian Society for hosting me as a fellow in the past and for hosting this event tonight. I am going to begin sharing my slides. Thank you again. And thank you so much to the audience for being here. I am really looking forward to your questions and comments later this evening. I am going to spend the next 40 minutes or so talking about a particular chapter of my book that is based largely on research that I did at the American Antiquarian Society several years ago, as Nan was mentioning. But first, I'm going to begin by telling sort of the overarching story and giving you the argument of my book, Like Children, which, as Nan mentioned, came out from NYU Press this year. Like Children is a cultural history of American childhood since the 18th century that centers African American children and the question of their value to white Americans. By the very nature of my subject, African American children, my book joins a robust scholarly conversation about Black childhood in early America. In recent years, there has been a great deal of critical work on the history of Black childhood. I could mention a lot of incredible scholars who have built and contributed to this field, from Wilma King to Nazira Wright, to Bridget Fielder, to Robin Bernstein, Catherine Capshaw. I could keep going on, Crystal Webster. These scholars, among other things, have helped to illuminate the lives of Black children in the past, and they have also exposed the patterns, structures, and conditions of harm that have disproportionately affected and imperiled Black children across American history. In turn, they have helped us to see connections between that past peril and the present. My book very much shares these concerns, but I also hope that my book can reorient how we look at them. That shift in focus or reorientation is bound up in the two phrases I started with: African American children's centrality to American childhood and Black children's value to white Americans. In much popular discourse and some scholarly discourse in the present, we often tell a story of Black children's exclusion from childhood, not their centrality to it. Further, we often explain white violence against Black children as the result of a societal failure to recognize Black children as children and to value them as children or to value them at all. My book asks us to look again at these premises. To be clear, not to question the fact of Black children's historic and present harm, but to reconsider what underlies it. In Like Children, I reframe the racialization of American childhood away from an axis of inclusion or exclusion to look instead at a pattern of white possessive investment in Black children and the extraction of value from them. This dynamic of investment and extraction is, of course, very much rooted in the system of hereditary American slavery, which considered Black children white property. But as I show, Black childhood's value has also exceeded Black children's economic importance to slavery and later to indentured labor and other forms of exploitation. In my book, I track how Black children's social status, cultural performances, intelligence, and feeling all became resources that were valuable to white Americans in different ways. Often, white Americans made use of Black children's value by directing it toward the shaping and development of white children, teaching white children the meaning of their humanity and how to measure it through the use of both fictional and real Black children. In Chapter 3 of my book, I describe this phenomenon as it appears across pedagogical children's literature from the 19th century. Here, in an 1870s anatomy textbook, Science and Story, Sammy Tubbs, the Boy Doctor, and Sponsy, the Troublesome Monkey, a text written by a white author explicitly for white children, but which nevertheless centered on the story of a fictional, precocious Black boy doctor, who is described in the book as our prodigy. In Science and Story, the author encourages his white readers to gain knowledge of themselves through Sammy, a dynamic I will explore in greater detail shortly. Sammy's usefulness to white child readers and the broader pattern of useful Black literary characters in which he fits is a striking example of Black children's inclusion and importance in the making of American childhood. And while this kind of inclusion obviously did nothing to benefit real Black children, it does present a new line of questions for thinking about Black childhood. For instance, how have Black children been incorporated into white American childhood in representational ways and/or in material ways? And how have they been integrated, even against their own wishes, into the cultural and social formations of childhood? I argue in my book that the figure of the Black prodigy, like fictional Sammy Tubbs here, can help us to understand this pattern of use and even reliance upon Black children. A prodigy is, by definition, meant to be an exception. But in my book, I track the repetition of this figure, or rather a pattern of white Americans labeling certain Black children as prodigies, and then subsequently spectacularizing and otherwise profiting from these Black children. Importantly, Sammy Tubbs, who I will be speaking about tonight, is the only fictional figure in my book. In all other chapters, I examine the stories of real Black children, and sometimes Black adults, who were cast to perform the idea, fiction, and uses of the prodigy. I begin in the first chapter with a study of Phyllis Wheatley, the early American poet, who was deemed the wonder of her age, and who made a profound impact on the literary culture and representation of American childhood. I then trace the story of Tom Wiggins, or Blind Tom, a pianist known in the 19th century as the marvelous musical prodigy. The story of Sammy Tubbs, which I will soon discuss, sits in the middle of my book as the third chapter. It is followed by the story of a child called Bright Oscar Moore, whose image appears on the cover of the book, and who is indentured to perform feats of mental precocity during the last dozen years of the 19th century. In the last chapter, I discuss the story of Philippa Schuyler, who performed gifted girlhood at the height of popular eugenics in the 1930s. In each of these stories, I follow how these Black children negotiated with the category of childhood that they were deemed exceptions to. In order to understand this changing relationship between the so-called prodigy and the child, the book necessarily follows how the category of childhood changed over the early American and later periods, both in its cultural representations, its legal definitions, and in terms of the scientific model of human development attached to it. In order to tell these stories and trace these various threads, this book relies on many different kinds of archives, from poetry to stage and performance ephemera, to IQ tests, to scrapbooks like that seen here, and to children's literature, which we'll be examining tonight. I ask my archival sources two primary questions across the book. First, what can they tell me about childhood and its construction over time? And second, what, if anything, can I learn about children, especially about real Black children at the center of my concern from these sources? While archival sources offer rich information about childhood's history, finding sources that speak directly to the lives of children in the 18th and 19th century is more difficult. My book as a whole, nevertheless, finds many ways to access children's marks, ideas, and voices in the archives. But the material I will share this evening is largely about childhood as imagined by white adults, and specifically about Black childhood and Black children as imagined by white adults. For that reason, I just want to note that there are a number of racist images ahead of us in our slides. I say that now just in the hopes that when they appear, you will have some preparation for what you're looking at. The racism embedded in science and story and surrounding our prodigy, Sammy Tubbs, is not generally evident in its illustrations, but instead requires a closer reading. In an early scene of Science and Story's first volume, we meet Sammy, confronted by two skeletons, one of an ape, another of a human man. Sammy is at first frightened, but quickly becomes curious and correctly identifies the differences between the two. At this point, the white doctor, who has been hiding, appears. He is satisfied with the minor joke he has played on Sammy, and he is also impressed by Sammy's ability to decipher human from animal. Yet, if Sammy demonstrates his learning in this scene, it is readers who are meant to gain from it. A fictive, freed Black child laborer in New York City, Sammy Tubbs was the pedagogical tool that Dr. Foote believed was key to, yet missing from, anatomical instruction for white children. By the 1870s, Edward Bliss Foote was a prosperous medical provider and the widely read author of Medical Common Sense and Plain Home Talk. Despite his considerable medical authority in many American homes, Foote believed that reaching the children in those homes would require him to employ a special and necessarily Black conduit. Fearing that anatomy and physiology made for dry reading, the doctor created Sammy with the hope that, as much as pill vendors coat their nauseous drugs with an envelope of sugar, his desired object of teaching white children about their human bodies might be ingeniously concealed in the acceptable garb of Sammy. Spanning over 2,000 pages across 5 illustrated volumes, Science and Story wove extensive lessons of anatomical, physiological, and hygiene lessons together with equally extensive episodes of Sammy Tubbs, Sponsy, and Dr. Hubbs, a successful white physician practicing out of his Manhattan townhouse. Each volume integrated its lessons in human science with morality tales and grotesque hijinks, the former that shaped Sammy's character, and the latter that subjected Sponsy to illness, violence, and eventual death. Though Sponsy the monkey's narrative tends towards destruction across the series, Sammy's arc progresses upward, from his initial position as Dr. Hubbs's doorboy to student, then to erstwhile medical practitioner himself. Science and Story's tale of Sammy's uplift tracks with Dr. Foote's stated support of Black education and Black-white integration, and with his anti-slavery roots. Yet the series betrays a more exploitative interest in Blackness that coincided with Foote's anti-racism, indicated by Foote's statements on Sammy's utility to white children. He writes, "And when my young readers who have had so much better home instruction see how ready Sammy was to learn everything useful, including the anatomy and physiology of the human body, it is to be hoped that they will not be less interested in studies of so much importance to their health and happiness. And when reading these volumes, keep up with Sammy. Do not let a little Black boy do better than you. Be sure when you have finished reading these pages that you know as much as he does of the human system." Foote's racial politics are evident in how he relates Sammy to white readers outside of the text, and in how he relates Sammy to Sponsy, the troublesome monkey, inside the story. Indeed, playing both foil and partner to him, Sponsy tugs Sammy from his human splendor, tethering him instead to the conceit of Black primate kinship. Moreover, though Foote rhymes the surnames of the Black child and the white doctor, Tubbs and Hubbs, their assonant relationship does not necessarily temper Sponsy's effect, because Hubbs was a double not to Sammy, but to the author himself. A wealthy, progressive white physician in New York City, Dr. Hubbs served as Dr. Foote's envoy within the story, and there's quite a visual resemblance in the illustrations here. Sponsy's doubling of Sammy and the fictional Dr. Hubbs' mirroring of the real Dr. Foote raises the question of Sammy's resemblance. There is, however, no evidence to suggest an original living Sammy behind Foote's fictional one. Foote never trained Black children in science or medicine, as he imagined his counterpart, Dr. Hubbs, to have done, nor is there any record of his engagement with the world of free Black New Yorkers that surrounds Sammy in the story. Why, then, would Dr. Foote have imagined a Black child and a prodigy to tell his story and teach his lessons? We can begin to locate an answer to this question if we turn to Toni Morrison and her identification of white Americans' persistent dependence on an Africanist presence for, quote, informing, stabilizing, and occasioning critical moments of discovery across American literary history. Morrison famously explored this dynamic in her essay, Playing in the Dark, where she expressed her interest in the way that Black people, quote, ignite critical moments of discovery or change or emphasis in literature not written by them. As Morrison shows us, this critical function of Blackness in literature not written for or by them, tells us something crucial about those who wrote it and who were meant to read it. She writes, "What Africanism became for and how it functioned in the literary imagination is of paramount interest because it may be possible to discover, through a close look at literary Blackness, the nature, even the cause, of literary whiteness." Sammy Tubbs is a figure of, or in Morrison terms, a function of, literary whiteness. Not finding a freed Black boy prodigy doctor with a pet monkey in his surroundings, but intuiting this configuration as instructive, Dr. Foote drafted Sammy within this American tradition. Sammy's specific location in an anatomy textbook for white children announces his more precise function, further underlined in the textbook's title, Science in Story, and timestamped by its 1870s publication. Conceived alongside the advance of Darwinism, Sammy was a finely tuned instrument for teaching white children about their humanity in terms both cultural and biological. It is worth noting that Dr. Foote's deployment of a Black anatomy instructor to teach white children about biology was undertaken in a logical, if perverse, relation to the field of human biology that was literally instructed through Black people and their bodies, because, as scholars like Deirdre Cooper Owens, Michael Sapple, and others have uncovered, extracting knowledge from Black people's bodies, living and dead, was core to American medicine. Excuse me, the lights have just gone off in my office. I discuss this history in greater detail in my book, but for now, I will just note this as the larger material context in which to understand the representational realm of children's literary history, the extractive pattern that Morrison underlines, and the lessons Sammy Tubbs was meant to instill. If it was often the task of 19th century sentimental literature to teach adult readers how they should feel towards children, literature for children had long been structured by a related didactic purpose, teaching young readers how they should behave or act as children. Indeed, English and Anglo-American authors of children's stories had inculcated readers in the behavior, appearance, and divergent fates of good and bad children since the 18th century at least, from catechisms in the New England Primer to the stories of Goody Two-Shoes, Sally Bark, and Jem Preston, who acted as reflections in which, quote, "the good themselves will see, the naughty what they ought to be." Yet by the mid-19th century, the consolidation of innocence in white child figures like Harriet Beecher Stowe's Eva from Uncle Tom's Cabin, and the vacating of innocence from Black child figures like Topsy of the same text, provided authors of conduct literature with a new and vivid coding. The mirror that such stories held up to children was no longer a metaphor for internal reflection. It had become a more practical looking glass in which a child's moral standing could be confirmed by racial appearance. In 1848, English publishers began to print two 1845 works by German author Heinrich Hoffmann, Slovenly Peter, translated from Struwwel Peter, and the Inky Boys, or here in this version, the Black Boys. By 1851, American publishers began to print Hoffmann's works as well in both faithful and broad adaptations. Like a century of conduct-centered literature before them, Hoffmann's Slovenly Peter and the Inky Boys instructed readers in moral conduct and discipline, conveying their lessons by illustrating the terrible consequences of improper, profane, and lazy behavior. Given their familiar resonance within past conduct-centered stories for children, neither text was entirely novel. Yet what would define these stories and their impact on American children's literature was their use of Blackness and racialized deformity as the embodied consequence of white children's misbehavior. Fie, naughty, wild, and slovenly Peter, I fear he never will be neater. For many, many weeks, no water has been near his cheeks. It is a year now, I declare, since he would let nurse comb his hair. And then those nails, 'tis very clear, they've not been cut at all this year. It is no wonder that I'll cry, oh, naughty, slovenly Peter, fie. In both its original and adapted forms, Slovenly Peter tells the story of a child who suffers disfiguring consequences after rejecting bodily discipline. Refusing to wash, to comb his hair, or to cut his nails, Peter's body undergoes a transformation that extends beyond his actual level of neglect and delivers excess racial meaning. His hair extends in a coarse and wild shock, his fingernails grow long and black as soot, and in most illustrations, a wash of color darkens his face. Rejecting self-mastery, Slovenly Peter's transformation presents a frightful trajectory away from the child's intended vector towards manhood or adulthood, suggesting that the failure to understand one's place at the top of the human hierarchy could reduce one to the bottom of it. Moreover, if Slovenly Peter shows that these consequences could be permanent, for Peter does not recover himself at the story's end, moreover, Slovenly Peter shows that these consequences could be permanent, for Peter does not recover himself at the story's end. He is left an abject figure of mockery. Presenting both a frightful vulnerability to transformation and the still worse possibility of permanence, Slovenly Peter played with the instability of race as a mutable and imprecise category, yet also as a category clarified through the violent consequences of being Black. The alignment of Slovenly Peter's U.S. debut with the enforcement, for instance, of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act underscores the salience of Blackness to Slovenly Peter's schema of racial consequences. An 1850 English adaptation captures the immediate danger of blackening in this context, presenting a version where Tom, the slovenly child in question, is mistakenly sold as a Negro slave, and by one descending panel of text and illustration becomes subject to an overseer's lash. This version performs a punitive recasting of the white slave trope of abolitionist literature. Tom does not represent the concept of innocent, suffering child that Anna Mae Dwayne's work defines, but instead he is the child who deserved, for becoming so Black, to suffer. No level of contrition can save this blackened child. For him, 'tis too late. If Slovenly Peter used blackening to enforce white children's bodily discipline, Hoffman's other story, The Inky Boys, wielded the same threat, but very differently, ostensibly to instill racial tolerance. The Inky Boys tells the story of 3 white boys who tease a so-called blackamoor for his black skin and are then punished by St. Nicholas for their indiscretion. They thought it was great fun to mock the Black and see him run. He's just as black as ink, they said, and laughed and pointed at his head. Following their acts of harassment, St. Nicholas dips each child into an inkwell till they are black as black can be. Early illustrations of the Inky Boys emphasize the inkiness of their resulting blackness more than its racial meaning. In this version here, the boys become flat and gray-black, just silhouettes that appear mechanical and toy-like. They do not really resemble the blackamoor. By becoming blacker and yet less human than the poor and harmless Black man, the Inky Boys are taught a lesson about the inhumanity of their racist attacks. Yet, whether you read this more or less generously, the basis of this fable remains clear. Blackness is either a pitiable condition or a punishment. The lesson of the Inky Boys is not necessarily to respect Black people, but rather to civilly contain one's disrespect. This lesson about racial civility is not the only lesson the Inky Boys circulated, however. In a McLaughlin Brothers 1867 edition of the Inky Boys, the uncivil children undergo a transformation that blackens them physiognomically, altering the crux of the story. In this version, the rowdy white children harass the blackamoor while waving a Union flag above their head. The flag both locates the story and gives it more political edge, identifying the children's behavior in historical, geographical, and class terms. The blackamoor, who in this case strolls the streets of a northern city, comes under the attack of children who support the Union but are unabashed in their racism. Ragged and urchin-like, these Inky Boys caricature children of the white working class, perhaps even referencing the white mobs whose racist violence surged in Civil War draft riots. The blackened transformation of these inky boys also signals something about the class of their whiteness. Predictably, the physical transformation that St. Nicholas's ink produces, curled hair, larger lips, and curved noses, is more citational of Black caricatures than of Black people's appearances. The boy's blackness is still permanent and inky, but it is also corked, or drawing on features of blackface minstrelsy in the enunciation of their eye whites and in the outline of the third child's lips. The moral of this edition of the Inky Boys elaborates on previous versions to a critical distinction. Again, readers learn that overt racism is condemnable, but they also learn who is to blame for this overly expressive form of it. Poor whites, identifiable by their rowdiness and their penchant for minstrelsy. When understood within the class politics of children's literature itself, as a consumer good primarily enjoyed by bourgeois children and their families, the moral resounds further. Rather than providing a mirror in which the good themselves will see the naughty what they ought to be, this version presents middle-class children with a story of who they are not and whom they should never emulate. Both Slovenly Peter and the Inky Boys enjoyed popularity, appearing in U.S. print from the 1850s far into the 20th century. The impact of these stories extends beyond their many imprints, however. The use of inking as the consequence of white children's misbehavior would appear in stories that stretched outside of Hoffman's conceit, as in the tale of Miss Mopsa, in which a white girl recklessly spills ink over her books, leading to her own ink blackening and eventual hanging, which Robin Bernstein discusses in her book Racial Innocence. Vivid in Miss Mopsa and others, the permeation of inky blackness into children's literature can also be viewed in another way, in the formation of individual reader consciousness. A mid-19th century copy of Arnaud Berquin's The Looking-Glass for the Mind, held at the American Antiquarian Society, bears the mark of a reader who found their storybook wanting of ink's instructive racial pedagogy. Though this edition was printed in 1845, The Looking-Glass comprised a set of Berquin's 18th century stories, which predated and perhaps influenced Hoffman's 19th century stories, including a particular story called Crazy Samuel, which presents a scenario so much like the Inky Boys as to suggest that Hoffman was directly referencing it when he wrote the Inky Boys. In Crazy Samuel, 3 white boys harass Samuel, a white elder. Samuel defends himself by throwing dirt and rocks at his attackers, who attempt to flee the chaos they've incited. The reader of this copy of The Looking-Glass might have recognized the resonance between Hoffman's story and Berquin's, for they decided to hand color the faces of the troublesome boys with dark brown ink. Here you can see the brown ink that covers over the etched engraving. As evocative as this coloring is, and for me, when I found this in the archive, I was kind of blown away by it. It's also true that it's not possible to know exactly what went through the mind of this reader when they marked their copy, or even when they did so. Yet, their inking of Berquin's troublemakers suggests that the reader had internalized Hoffman's story, identifying not with its child characters, but with its discipline, turning Samuel's retaliatory dirt into their own punishing ink. Sammy Tubbs does not, in any obvious sense, resemble the Inky Boys. The illustrated representations of his blackness are not generally heavy with caricature, and though he learns many lessons, he is not often subject to frightful lessons like those learned by Peter and Tom and the rowdy street children. Yet, like the forms of blackness that appear across these illustrated works, Sammy's blackness is pedagogical. It is by consuming Sammy's story that white readers achieve their knowledge. For them, Sammy is less a mirror in which writers might see themselves and more a facilitator of their self-conception, like the inky characters of previous stories. In fact, he is inked in a way, too. Describing Sammy as, quote, a Ben Franklin in jet enamel and ivory trimmings, Foote discloses that Sammy is, after all, blackened. Though this comparison seems to place our Prodigy on par with Franklin, Readers who were literate in the racial alchemies of children's literature would know that jet enamel was more often a transformative substance than an embellishment. Ultimately, Science and Story is an archive of amalgamated substances, of science integrated into story, of white childhood's dependence on Blackness, and of the author's stated anti-racism printed within a racially extractive literary structure. Rather than pull apart and untangle these complexities, the most useful way to understand them, I think, is by looking at the purpose they served. The last volume of Foote's Science and Story is instructive on this point. This volume, here listed for private reading, offers readers Sammy's Introduction to Human Reproductive Anatomy. In making this topic the subject of interracial conversation within its pages, Foote appeared to declare a politically radical integrationist position. And yet, what Sammy and Dr. Hubbs ultimately discuss across this book gives away Foote's actual political interests: eugenics, or as he described it, the science of race improvement. In this volume, Dr. Hubbs explains to Sammy that to, quote, avoid the birth of unwanted fruit and monstrosities, and to hasten the moral and physical redemption of the human race, it was imperative to curb haphazard reproduction while promoting the peopling of our planet with better specimens of humanity. Sammy thoroughly agrees and casts his own additional doubt on the possibility of interracial reproduction. Only when scientists had, quote, by careful investigation, removed physiological doubts regarding such interblending, would it be possible for Sammy to imagine interracial marriage and parentage. Here, Sammy is lecturing to a crowd of white women on reproduction. Again, this image is in many ways very subversive in its representational field. And yet, ultimately, Foote uses the scene to reinforce the existing racial order, which is the project to which he devoted the end of his life. Between his writing of Science and Story in the early 1870s and his 1906 death, Dr. Foote and his son, Dr. Edward Bliss Foote, prescribed, wrote, and advocated for eugenic race improvement extensively, creating a shared archive in the form of many E. B. Foote authored publications from their Murray Hill Publishing Company. In 1886, with his father as consultant, Dr. Foote Jr. published The Radical Remedy in Social Sciences, or Borning Better Babies Through Regulating Reproduction by Controlling Conception, which decries go-as-you-please reproduction and the, quote, hydra-headed monsters of crime, pauperism, and disease that resulted from it. The Footes advertised Science and Story, the series, in Borning Better Babies back pages. The inclusion of Sammy Tubbs's story within Dr. Foote's eugenic project of producing so-called better babies reiterates, again, the strange forms of inclusion that have not served Black children, but that instead prompt us to ask, I think helpfully, inclusion in what? That is, what is the construct, category, and aim of American childhood? What has it been and what is it? And where have Black children fit in it? Given the exceptional and idiosyncratic nature of Science and Story and of its author, Edward Bliss Foote, it may seem difficult to read this text for larger currents in the racial politics of childhood. Though it was printed in several editions, it is difficult to know, for instance, exactly how many children it reached. Yet the importance of Science and Story exceeds its status as representative. Rather, Science and Story is a valuable archive of American childhood because of its situation at an intersection. It reveals the racial structure of children's literature that came before it, and it anticipates the future arena, eugenic management, in which struggles over race and childhood would soon be fought. The text is valuable, too, in Sammy himself. Sammy was not so much invented by Dr. Foote as he was pulled from a larger pattern. The invention of this Black child prodigy character helps to illuminate a much larger pattern in which Black children, real living ones, were conscripted into roles like his and made to give body and mind and character to a larger project of American childhood and to its culture and development. As I mentioned earlier, the 4 other chapters of Like Children are concerned with these children, and most importantly, concerned with uncovering what these real children did with the racial skips of white imaginations that were given to them. Admittedly, in the case of Sammy Tubbs, there is no mark left or no clear mark left by a Black child in the archive to indicate what Black children might have done with Sammy Tubbs if they had encountered him. But it is with at least the thought or maybe the wish of a Black child reader in mind, and of that child finding their way to science and story and making or unmaking something of it, or perhaps marking it, that I will close my talk tonight. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Camille. That was such a great talk, and such a wonderful book, and so beautifully researched. There's just so much information. And I know there's a lot more that you could say, but you gave us a really wonderful insight into this particular chapter and a sense of the overall book itself. We have plenty of time for questions from the audience. If you have questions, go ahead and put them into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. But let me just start, if I could. I want to circle back to something you alluded to. You mentioned some toward the end of the talk. I wonder if you could say a bit more, if you know, about the readership and circulation of Science in Story. And I know that Foote published other volumes earlier, but if this was as widely read as his medical publications, is that something that you were able to glean from your research?
Yes, thank you so much for that question and for your remarks. That is a really good question, and not one that I can answer with full definition, but I have indications around how widely this text was published, printed, and read. As you mentioned, Dr. Foote had quite a wide readership before he began publishing these children's books. And he would boast in a few places that he had sold hundreds of thousands of copies of his medical common sense and other books and pamphlets that he had produced. And those numbers are possibly exaggerated, but he did have a really popular medical practice and advice practice by the time that he began writing these children's stories. So he was already known to audiences and readers. There are a few ways of understanding how many copies were circulating of Science in Story. He printed them in multiple formats. So there were cheap paperback versions, and then there were these hardback copies, which actually I'm sitting next to one of them here. And there were some embossed in black here and others that were embossed in gold. So there were multiple prices at which he was selling these. And he reprinted them, I think, 4 times between the original 1874 publication and maybe 1896. And so there's a sense that there was some demand and interest in these books, though I don't have a firm number on what that was. Another way in which I have kind of come to understand the presence, at least, of these books is where they exist in the present. So they're pretty easy to find in many archives and libraries. They're all around, and you can very easily purchase copies of them. So that's, anecdotal, but also part of the story of this text. But I will say, going back to what I had mentioned earlier, the idea of this text needing to be representative is not necessarily my interest. It's not necessarily that, this was so widely popular as to shape a common understanding of human anatomy or of childhood, but more to understand this text as an indicator of a larger pattern and of stories that repeat across a lot of different kinds of texts.
Great. Yeah, thank you. It would be great for you to talk a little bit more about other parts of the book. And I'm particularly interested to hear you say a bit about how you selected the Black child prodigies that you did for and you went over that early on to sort of indicated the other examples in the book, and you talk about them so effectively and the connections between them. I just wonder if you could talk a bit about the process and your journey in identifying the children that you do in these chapters.
Yes, it definitely was a process, and I didn't ever set out to write a book about a series of Black child prodigies. The project began when it was my dissertation research, out of my research into the figure who is on the cover of the book, whose name is Oscar Moore and who performed as Bright Oscar Moore in the late 1880s and 1890s, so a bit after these stories from Dr. Foote. And I was really captivated by trying to find out the story of this child who was performing a version of mental precocity, answering questions and doing math problems in front of white audiences. And this was making money for a series of white men who were indenturing him from the age of 2. I wanted to understand just that child's story and what that performance meant to white audiences. And so that's where this began. And in order to understand that story, I needed to do a few things. One was to understand kind of what was this prodigy an exception to? That is, what was the construct of childhood, especially of children's mental capacity in the 1880s that he was being measured against? And so that kind of began to be a thread that pulled me backwards in time and eventually forwards in time as well, into this context of the eugenics movement. And I also wanted to understand this performance and this genre of prodigy. And in the case of this child, Oscar Moore, who was performing, it became very clear that his performances were often marked in reference to another figure who had been performing before him, who was known as Blind Tom. This is Tom Wiggins, who was a neurodivergent pianist and composer, and he was performing from the from the 1850s until his death in the early 20th century. And so I needed to kind of understand that relationship. And once I found kind of one node, I found many more. And for instance, in Science and Story, in Sammy Tubbs' story, there are lots of subtle and unsubtle references back to Phyllis Wheatley. And so in kind of seeing this story and this character repeat, both in fiction, as in what I spoke about in this talk, and in these performances or representations or castings of Black children, I started to understand that despite the fact that a prodigy was supposed to be an exception, it was for some reason a performance that was demanded again and again or desired in some way. And so that kind of formed the arc of the process of understanding what does this term mean? What does it encompass? What does it allow for in terms of producing an idea of childhood?
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's fascinating. It just seemed that sort of one example led you to another, and it flows very beautifully in the book, and ending with Philippa Schuyler and their connections there that you make with Phyllis Wheatley as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, Phyllis Wheatley, I'll just say briefly, shows up and continues to be referenced as an exemplar, as she was in many ways, all across the stories in the book, including in the Brownies book, which is the children's magazine that Du Bois and Jessie Fawcett were producing in the 1920s. And so there's all of these stories end up being quite linked.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You mentioned early on about how the category of childhood has changed over time. I'm curious about your sense of age and what age or ages constitute childhood, and if that changes or changed over time. Does that make sense? Is that because
Yes.
it's something that we have thought about here in some of the work that we've done in digitizing children's materials written by children. So where is the cutoff point? So and we ended up with age 19, but I just wonder if that's something
Okay.
that you struggled with or thought about, because that concept of childhood certainly must change over time.
Yes. I looked at it from multiple angles. The first thing I will just say is there's a wonderful book by Habib Ibrahim called Black Age, which really looks at kind of the problematic, the trouble with trying to ascertain this normative scale of human development and aging as it was shaped in relation to race, and therefore kind of the strange ways in which Black children and adults' ages are kind of marked apart or harder to pin down in all sorts of kind of cultural representations. So there's a bit of kind of a theoretical interest in age that I'm invested in the book. But I'm also interested in kind of the practical, often legal, and biological understandings of who children are at different moments. Uh, and so earlier in the book, I look at kind of changing understandings of childhood. For instance, the idea of children of tender age. What did that mean in 19th century law? It was a vague construct that was not attached to a particular number, but it was attached to this idea of children under a certain age being vulnerable and needing parental and in particular maternal care. And the number that was roughly always floating around there was about 10 years old. So that gives you a sense of how young children were being defined by the middle of the 19th century, which was very different from a century earlier and 2 centuries earlier, certainly. Later in the book, as I begin looking at eugenics, there are these much more finely graded understandings of how children should develop at year 1, 2, 3, and onward. And so in the case of Philippa Schuyler, that chapter is devoted to scrapbooks that her mother kept of her. And they are marking her development at every month, every week, and every year. And so there's by the 20th century, this sense of children's developmental ages are very, finely delineated and important to mark. So that's not necessarily a practical answer of what to do with how to describe children's literature, but just a sense of how kind of slippery age is in trying to study it.
Indeed. Yeah, that's great. We have a question from Susan Bragg. I think you mentioned, she says, the difficulty of identifying Black child readers, but I wonder if you can speak more about the response of Black audiences to the various themes of your chapters on prodigies. Also, your book sounds amazing and can't wait to read it. Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that question. Yes, with this science and story text in particular, I have always wished to find some sort of source that would allow me to kind of write more about the interaction of Black children with that book. And I have not found anything that kind of gave me the space or I didn't feel the liberty to do that. But I imagine that because the book circulated, Black children did encounter that story. And so that's something I just want to keep in the background and at least mention. And with this broader performance of Prodigy and the spectacularization of certain Black children by white audiences that I'm primarily tracking, there are different ways in which Black audiences appear and contest or are separated from this cultural phenomenon. By the late 19th century, where I'm writing about figures like Bright Oscar Moore, I see through kind of newspaper advertisements and a lot of periodicals that there is an audience for Oscar Moore's performances that is primarily, though not probably all, white. but that is directed by white interests and kind of for a white audience. But alongside that, by the 1890s, there is in the Black press and all over references to Black children performing as prodigies being celebrated by their Black communities. And a lot of this has to do with ideas of Black talent, ideas of racial pride, and some of it also has to do with the ways in which ideas of exceptionality, including kind of eugenic ideas of exceptionality, are taken up by largely middle-class Black communities in the early 20th century and onward. So in the case of Philippa Schuyler, there are all sorts of ways in which she is both celebrated for being a Black child, but also celebrated for being in some ways seen as racially superior. And she's celebrated by Black audiences for that as well as white. And so it's an answer that changes depending on where in the story you are looking. But certainly the book is primarily looking at basically a white imagination of this figure, but a Black engagement with and sometimes contestation of that.
Thank you. I have a question about the marking in the books that you noted. They showed that example from the collections here. I wonder how often you came across that sort of marginalia, or just that sort of intentional marking in many of the sources that you looked at. Is that unusual, or did you come across that with some frequency?
That is a great question. In my research, it was unusual, especially for that period. I have often worked with children's books that children have signed their name in, and that's often the way in which you see their mark. But coloring over illustrations, at least in 19th century children's books that I've looked at, I haven't seen that many times. And so that source was just such a surprise when I encountered it. But later in the last chapter of my book, going back to this figure, Philippa Schuyler, it is based around a series of scrapbooks, as I mentioned, that her mother kept of her, but she introduces her own marks, her own drawings and illustrations all over those scrapbooks. And so that is the space in which I get to work with an archive, that I'm not searching for tiny little scraps of what children were thinking or doing or saying, but instead there's a much more kind of robust field in which to understand those kinds of marks.
Yeah, and I'm curious about the handbook that was produced in conjunction with the performance of Moore. Is that what? Do a lot of those exist, and did those get marked up?
Yes. I imagine that there are so many more copies of the handbook. There was one image of that in my slideshow. It was a prop used in the performance of Oscar Moore, and it was a booklet of about this size, filled with questions that he would answer, thousands of questions. That is the only one I've ever found, but it was cheaply printed and mass produced, and so I know that there were many of them. And I found a lead of another slightly different version, which I haven't been able to get my hands on.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, this is fascinating. And this is your last chance to put questions in, because we're running out of time. I think but I just want to make sure if there are any other questions. I want to really thank you so much for sharing this work. It's again fascinating. It's a wonderful book. It is well worth reading. So I encourage you to get a copy. I really appreciate you taking the time to share it with us today. And before we lose our audience, I want to just say a bit about some upcoming programs. We have coming up a week from today, next Tuesday evening, December 3rd at 7 p.m., a hybrid program with Seth Rockman, author of Plantation Goods, A Material History of American Slavery. So that will be, again, a hybrid program. So on site here at the library, and then also virtual. We will live streaming it. And then looking ahead to the new year, we will be hosting a virtual program in our Perspectives from the Collection series on the Bay Psalm book. And this will be on January 7th at 4 p.m. And it will feature collector Michael Zinman, curator Elizabeth Pope, and conservators Babette Genrich and Nancy Frisella Lee. So we hope you can join us for those. And you can go to our website and look at all of our upcoming programs for next spring. And we thank you so much for joining us this evening. And thank you again to Camille Owens. Have a good evening.